Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie, and in this video I'm going to be looking at the weekend of January the 3rd and 4th, 2026. The main event of this weekend is a full moon, and in this video I'm going to be looking at this full moon in some detail because I think this full moon could be quite important, particularly from the perspective of the United States. But before I look at this full moon, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for the weekend. So here is the chart of the weekend set for midnight on January the 4th, New York time. So here is the chart. Don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. So yes, this chart represents the central point of the weekend, New York time, but right at the middle of it. And you can see that we have the moon at 24 degrees Cancer. So the weekend starts with the moon in Cancer, and by the end of the weekend, it is in Leo. So on Sunday at 1:43 p.m. London time, the moon does enter Leo. It will be earlier if you're in New York. So I think that the moon enters Leo. I think that would be at 8:43 in the morning on Sunday. So there is sort of a difference there. Certainly, Saturday and Sunday, could be different days. And one thing about what's happening astrologically, which I sort of mentioned, I think in my last video, certainly for some of the signs, is that we are starting to see quite a serious elemental imbalance, because we have planets in water signs. You can see here, I mean, you've got the moon and Jupiter in Cancer. You've got Saturn in Pisces, and you've got planets in Earth signs. Loads of planets in Capricorn, 4 planets in Capricorn. But what about the air signs? What about the fire signs? The positive signs. In astrology, the air and the fire signs are regarded as being positive, not because they are better than the water and earth signs. It's just how one describes it. It's kind of a yin and yang kind of thing. So there is an enormous amount of negativity in the chart at the moment. Just remember, I'm not using negative in a negative sense. I'm using it more in the sense of sort of passivity, perhaps, and sort of responding rather than acting. So there is a lot of negativity there, with this earth and water preeminence. This does change though on Sunday once the moon moves into Leo, but it's poor moon on the moon in Leo on its own. It has to carry the entire positivity of the solar system, at least from the Earth's perspective. And so that can be tough, but when with the moon in Leo, there is perhaps some scope for taking the initiative, making things happen, perhaps just keeping a brave face on things. Though there's nothing wrong with having all this water and earth. It has its own strength, and with certainly, if you look at what's happening with the moon and Jupiter, the moon and Jupiter are making a conjunction. So you've got a moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer. That's a great aspect. It's an aspect that is, very lucky. I mean, Moon and Jupiter, they both work extremely well in this sign. Moon is in its own sign. Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, and the Moon is in Jupiter's sign. Jupiter is in the Moon. Sorry, the Moon is it. Let's say it again. Jupiter is in the Moon's sign. The Moon is in Jupiter's exaltation. So we're in mixed reception. So overall, that is a very fortunate aspect, and to an extent, that Moon-Jupiter conjunction, defines the weekend. So as we go through Saturday, that Moon-Jupiter conjunction gets stronger and stronger, and then it becomes exact. Well, it depends where you are, but it's good enough. So that's something to be positive about. And I'm really feel good about that Moon Jupiter conjunction. But there are other things going on, and in particular, there's a full moon. And I do think that this is an important full moon. It's the first full moon of the year, and it's in Cancer. Moon is I think the full moon is at 13 degrees 2 minutes Cancer, and 13 degrees Cancer. Well, that should ring a bell, because that is the sun of the United States, July the 4th. It's exactly 6 months to go before Independence Day 2026, which is the 150th anniversary. 250th anniversary. So maybe that's something to look forward to, but I think this could be a difficult full moon for the United States, and I will be talking about this later. I don't want to talk about the United States at this stage in the video, but if you look at this full moon, it happens pretty close to a sesquiquadrate with Uranus. So we have the Sun making a 135 degree aspect to Uranus. Then we get the moon opposition Sun. So we've got this full moon tied up with Uranus, and it's also tied up with Mars. You can see, I mean, Mars is at 15. Mars and Venus. I mean, it's tied up. Venus is at 13 degrees 15 Capricorn. Mars is at 15.9 Capricorn. So very much tied up with those two planets. And I think that the Mars thing is really something that we need to think about, because we just got this growing power of this Sun-Mars conjunction. I think we've already seen it. I mean, if we look at this tragedy in Switzerland, it wasn't the only fire going on. I think there was a fire in Amsterdam. A church got burnt down. I think there was a New Year's Eve gathering in the Kherson region of what is now occupied by Russia, which seems to be deliberately targeted by a Ukrainian drone. So the Ukrainians did what they could to disrupt civilian life in certainly in Kherson region, and so it wasn't. So it's not just what happened in Switzerland, but Sun Mars. Remembering that Mars was also sesquiquadrate Uranus. You do have an association with fire. I mean, that is one link with Sun Mars. We've already seen it, because we had that Sun Mars conjunction at the time when the new year became exact, but it's getting closer and closer, that conjunction, and so we are seeing perhaps an increasingly dramatic picture unfold, and I mean that is something I will be talking about later in this video. I mean, there are some other things going on. Mars is quintile Saturn, so Mars is at 15 degrees 15 degrees Capricorn. Saturn is at 26, 27 Pisces. So Mars and Saturn are exactly 72 degrees apart. And this quintile might be about the kind of impression we're trying to create. And some of us might feel that there is value in coming over as being sort of quite tough and rather grim. Maybe that we might feel that is the best approach as we get into the new year, and certainly through this first weekend of a new year, perhaps almost deliberately emphasizing the death and the destruction around us. Or maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm picking up on this Mars quintile Saturn. So that is another aspect going on. So overall, it's perhaps a mixed weekend. I don't think that this full moon is going to be particularly easy. particularly on a collective level. On a more sort of personal level, there is the Moon-Jupiter conjunction. And I think that the Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer is great, and I think it might be that this Moon-Jupiter conjunction mitigates the full moon. On the other hand, with Moon-Jupiter conjunction, we shouldn't just assume it's going to be fortunate. A Moon-Jupiter conjunction can be about something suddenly coming into being, the bubble popping, the bubble bursting, something having to manifest. But I think just overall personal level, I probably see the Moon-Jupiter conjunction as being a plus rather than a minus. So that's the view if we set things from New York. If we set the weekend to Sydney, Australia, here is the picture. So at midnight on the 4th, the moon is at 14 degrees Cancer. So, there's a bit of a difference. The Moon-Jupiter conjunction, if you are in Australia and Neptune, is going to take place relatively late on Sunday. So that's one thing going on. There is, as far as the full moon is concerned. So if you're in the Americas, the full moon I think is at quite early on Sunday, because I make it that the full moon is at 10:03 London time. So in New York, quite early on Saturday. Yes. So the full moon is at 5:03 a.m. New York time. Now, if you are in Australasia, you can see that the full moon is much later. It's sort of on Saturday night. So there is some difference there. But still, the moon's in Cancer for most of the weekend, wherever you are. So there isn't necessarily a huge amount of difference between, say, the United States and Australia. And then there is the heliocentric view. So here is the heliocentric chart for the weekend. Here we have it. We obviously set the Sun as the center of the solar system. Now the Earth, we've got an Earth-Venus opposition, and so this Earth-Venus opposition. Well, how do we see that? I mean, Earth-Venus opposition is kind of like a Sun-Venus. It's kind of like a Sun-Venus conjunction. And, I don't regard a geocentric Sun-Venus conjunction as being necessarily fortunate, because just Venus is too close to the Sun. Venus is getting burnt out. And that may talk about, power disparities, one person not taking another person seriously, or one person treating another person badly. That's how Sun-Venus conjunctions can work. And so Earth opposition Venus might mean that some of us feel hard done by. Not everyone is being respected. It could also be about art and aesthetics and how we respond to the beauty or ugliness of our environment. And maybe it's about responding more to the ugliness rather than the beauty, because there is a tension here between the Earth and Venus. And the Earth is also starting to make an opposition to Mars, and that's very much with us. And it's the same thing as the geocentric Sun conjunct Mars. It's the same aspect, just looking at it from a different view. And I think it all feeds into the full moon, because this full moon is tied up with Mars, as I'll be discussing later in the video. So it's now time to look at things from the viewpoint of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for the weekend of January the 3rd and 4th, 2026. Aries, you may feel that you have to adopt a rather tough approach, maybe for no particular reason. You just feel that's the way it is. And the reason I'm saying that is because the weekend starts with a quintile aspect between Mars and Saturn. So Mars and Saturn are 72 degrees apart. So that's 1/5 of the circle. So Mars and Saturn, are often seen as a rather difficult pairing, but this is a quintile, and a quintile is a somewhat voluntary aspect. It's what you can do. It's what you can put out if you want to. It can be about something that is created. And so Aries, you may respond to whatever's going on around you in a way that you feel that you have to give an impression. And so the impression you give might be, rather grim. You might want to emphasize the negatives, not necessarily because you are negative, but because you feel it is the best approach. Let's make all of this serious. Let's not trivialize things. Let's, if possible, downplay the lighter side of things. Let's maybe scale down the humor. Now, that's not something you have to do, but it's something you might want to do because it creates a certain impression. And if you handle it correctly, you can indeed give yourself, a certain amount of gravitas. And, all of this is coming at a time when there are no planets in fire signs, unless you count Chiron, which I don't. I don't count that as a major planet, and I don't count Chiron as contributing to the elemental balance, even though Chiron is stationary direct. And there's only one planet in air signs, Pluto. So with no fire and hardly any air, that says something about the weekend. Certainly it says something about Saturday. Saturday just could be a day when things just aren't happening. You try, but there's no response. And people they're quite reactive. There is a response, but it's a reactive response. People are not really in the mood for contributing anything new. And as an Aries, you might find that quite frustrating. But you might kind of feel that you have to join the party, which is perhaps what I talked about when I was suggesting that you adopt maybe a fairly grim approach. You cloak yourself with this negativity, and maybe that is the right approach, rather than trying to go out on a limb, trying to take the initiative, trying to be positive, enthusiastic. It just might not work, particularly if you're doing it in a very sort of extroverted way. Now, I'm not suggesting that it need be a bad weekend, but you just have to use the energies correctly. And of course, the main thing happening over the weekend is a full moon. And this full moon may represent the culmination, of the last couple of weeks, going through the Christmas and a new year. Something might have been building up, and you've been trying to work things out. And with this full moon, it might occur to you. Remember, it's a full moon in Cancer. It might occur to you that you do need to bring things down to earth. Perhaps things have just gone too far. Perhaps you've gone too far, and you might feel that you need to stabilize things a bit. You don't have to always be in the center of things, and it can be quite exhausting if the pressure is always on you. And in terms of your ambitions, it's certainly a time, Aries, when you have very powerful ambitions, and it's good that you have powerful ambitions. But sometimes you need to take a step back, and maybe that's what this weekend is all about. Particularly on Saturday, you don't have to be always doing things, always planning, always being in the fore of things. No, not at all. So that might be how you might want to reflect on it with this full moon. And the full moon might also make you think about the balance between your family and your ambitions, or your work, if you have if you have a job or if you have a business, and the full moon may make you realize that if you go too far in any one direction, you could exhaust yourself. But there's a positive side to this full moon, because the full moon, okay, the full moon happens, and then the moon starts moving towards a conjunction to Jupiter. So this Moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer, I think it's a great aspect. I mean, I certainly think it's a great aspect for you, Aries. I think it does give you stability and grounding. It gives you anchoring, and it might make you realize that things aren't so bad, and you might start to appreciate the small things in life. Perhaps just being at home, being with your family. You don't have to be looking for dramatic initiatives, and you don't have to always be in a hurry. There is a certain hurry, I'll say that. There are 4 planets in Capricorn. I think that you can very much benefit from these four planets in Capricorn over the next couple of weeks in terms of getting what you want, but you can't go sort of hell for leather in terms of getting this desire, achieving your desires. Sometimes you have to stop and review, and maybe that's what this weekend is all about. And because it's a full moon, full moons are a time of insight, and Aries, you might have some powerful insights into what it's all about, and you might realize that perhaps some of the things you've been striving for aren't necessarily worth the effort. Taurus, you're probably feeling okay this weekend. I think it looks reasonably good. I don't think that it need be an especially hectic weekend. You do have to look after yourself, though. I mean, you've got there is a Moon-Jupiter conjunction over the weekend, and I think that's probably what you should be focusing on. The Moon-Jupiter conjunction should make you feel comfortable, especially if you're in control. If you're somewhere where you want to be, you don't have to try too hard, and everything, as far as possible, should be just simple, straightforward. You don't want to make too much of an effort. I think that is important. As a Taurian, you can sometimes put too much effort into things. Take things incredibly seriously, perhaps regard everything as a matter of life and death. But I really would not recommend it. Just do what's easiest, at least for the weekend, because I do think that that is the right approach. I think that you could get caught up in other things, and if you do get caught up in things which are serious, which perhaps regard a lot of people, maybe that may not be quite so good. And the problem perhaps that we have, if there is a problem, I'm not saying it need be a problem, but it could be a problem, is the fact that the Sun is getting really rather close to Venus. You can see it here. The Sun and Venus are less than a degree apart, and over the weekend getting closer and closer, the Sun and Venus. And Venus is, of course, your ruler, and it's combust. You can talk about Cazimi combustion, where you've got the Sun and Venus being 17 arc minutes apart. Maybe that's fortunate. From what I can see, Cazimi is not great. It just makes things even more combust. So there is potentially something that could overwhelm you. It could be starting to overwhelm you, and the question is, what might it be? I mean, it might be that things you have got used to, things that you trust, just take up too much energy. Could be about your family. What's happening in your home. It may be that if you spend too much time worrying about home and family, you can't think about anything else. And it's certainly not a time to be allowing members of your family to make you feel guilty or to pressurize you. That's absolutely not what you need. You need space, and you need headroom. Really, you need room to grow. You need room to explore in your own way. You don't have to be in a hurry, but take advantage of these 4 planets in Capricorn. With those 4 planets in Capricorn, Taurus, it is a time to be taking things further, to just be seeing what's available. And the last thing you need is some small domestic detail to force you down to earth, and that's not what you need. And I think that you would potentially get quite frustrated. So if anything is taking up too much of your time, particularly if it's relating to home and family, then your alarm bell should be going, and you should create a bit of distance. You need space. You need room to be yourself, and to see what's available. And ideally, you should focus on that Moon-Jupiter conjunction. That Moon-Jupiter conjunction should be just low intensity, just doing something just because, not feeling that there is any pressure. And there should not be any pressure. And it's certainly not a weekend for doing anything that is dramatic and spontaneous. I mean, spontaneity is always good. It's often good, rather, but not this weekend. If you do something without thinking about it on the spur of a moment, there's a very good chance that you've misunderstood the situation. It seemed to be a good thing at the time, but when you actually put it into action, things could go wrong very quickly. So keep it simple. And I think that's something that is really very important this weekend. Keep it simple. Avoid things that are complicated. Avoid people that are complicated. Indeed, in fact, you should perhaps avoid members of your family who are complicated, unless you're dealing with family members who need your help, need your attention. Well, that is a different matter. And so if you can adopt that approach and not be tied to anything, then I think it should be a reasonable weekend. Gemini. There's a full moon over the weekend. I mean, I have to talk about the full moon, don't I? I mean, the full moon affects all of us. I'm a Gemini. It's going to affect me, surely. And this full moon is in Cancer. So if we've got full moon in Cancer, that means you've got moon in Cancer, opposition the sun in Capricorn. And so what kind of impact might this full moon have? Well, it could be a financial full moon. It's right across the finance axis, of your chart. I mean, you will have a full moon on the finance axis of your chart twice a year. Once, around now, and then you'll have it again. I don't know precisely when, but sometime between June the 21st and July the 22nd, or something like that. So you have this twice a year, and so this can be a time when Geminis do have to think about money, and perhaps you have to think about money in rather a sort of an intense way. And there is a danger here, Gemini, that you look at money and it just seems incredibly complicated, more complicated than you'd like it to be. And you just make that assumption. Yeah, this is a problem. I have to really work this through. I have to understand things. It's not going to be easy. And the message with this full moon is, as far as possible, to keep it simple. You might be making it overcomplicated, and the fundamentals of the matter are actually pretty straightforward. Maybe you don't want to see it as being straightforward, but actually it is. And so if you're dealing with something that's straightforward, then the prescription is straightforward. It's clear what you have to do. So if you've got a financial worry, something bothering you financially, then it's actually pretty obvious what you need to do but at some level you don't necessarily want to do it. You'd rather make it complicated, for your own reasons, and I would not obviously suggest that course of action. And additionally, we've got a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter, in Cancer, and again, this Moon-Jupiter conjunction could be, quite financial in its nature, and so it's fortunate, a Moon-Jupiter conjunction, and maybe you see an opportunity. Maybe if you're really honest with yourself, you see a way of improving your financial situation, even if it's something you, at some level, don't really want to do. But it's something, I believe, Gemini, that is very much worth pursuing. And also, if we're talking about full moons, we're talking about something coming to the surface. We're talking about an understanding. And maybe, Gemini, you come to a new understanding about money. I mean, it may be about your financial situation, the specifics of your financial situation, or it just could be an understanding about, what needs to be done. Now, when you've got that kind of understanding, it doesn't necessarily mean that anything's going to happen. That's the way it always is. It's very easy to understand what's going on. I mean, it's relatively easy to understand what's going on. Financially, psychologically, I do believe that. I think that one can get to the psychological roots of an issue very quickly. But that doesn't mean to say that you can resolve the problem through understanding. Understanding is only 1% of the journey. The rest of the journey is actually doing something about it. So the question is, are you able to actually use what you learn? And maybe that is possible. And perhaps, Gemini, what is needed is some commitment to change. And in this light, one aspect we have, which I think it's on Sunday, is a biquintile between Mercury and Uranus. So Mercury and Uranus are 144 degrees apart. That's a biquintile aspect. That's 2/5 of the circle. So it's a very 5 aspect. We're talking about fiveness. When we talk about fiveness, we're talking about what you're trying to create, perhaps through the power of your own will. So, Gemini, if you want to create change, then it's not about just being spontaneous. In fact, it's a bad weekend for being spontaneous. That's not what it's about. It's instead about working out what needs to be done. It's not about having a spontaneous revolution. It's about planning the revolution. So, Gemini, you plan your own personal revolution. You work out exactly how you're going to stand out. You work out how you are going to initiate change, and it's a step-by-step approach. Nothing spontaneous about it. And you do that, and in the end, you realize what needs to be done, and that is, or can be, the moment of change. Or by the end of a weekend, perhaps that's your task, your homework. It does seem that something may have to change, and over the weekend you can get to grips with it, and you can do it in a methodical way. It's not going to be spectacular, but you reach your conclusions, you decide what you need to do, and then you take the first step. Cancer. There is quite a lot going on. We do have a full moon, and this full moon does, of course, affect you. We have a full moon in Cancer. We've got the moon in your sign, and its opposition the sun in Capricorn. So this full moon, it's across the main axis of your chart. So when we think about that full moon, it may be about you and others, you and everything else. Where do you stop, and where does the rest of the world start? And is it all satisfactory? And so, one way of looking at the full moon is to say that, well, this says something maybe about relationships, how you get on with other people. That is that would be the classic way of looking at this full moon. I'm sure if you read any of your sort of 12 sign or your Cancerian forecast for today, whoever does it, they're going to emphasize this full moon, and they're probably going to emphasize relationships. So I'm not going to be unique in talking about relationships. And so if we're talking about full moons, well, full moons can often be about some kind of realization. We start to understand something. We see something for what it really is. And maybe Cancer, you see a person for what they really are. For the first time, you understand. And times of understanding, well, they can be pleasant. Maybe you understand that someone really is there for you. They're going to look after your best interests. But it can be the opposite. You can realize the limitations of another person. You might even realize you don't like someone. You can't be close to them for much longer. So that may be a way in which this full moon works. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the power of this full moon. Twice a year there is a full moon across this main axis of your chart, and time goes faster and faster as one grows older. So it's not such an unusual event. But this full moon perhaps has its own qualities. I mean, this full moon is tied up with Mars. It's also tied up with Venus. So I think that there is a particular relationship angle with this full moon. So Cancer, do think about all of the relationships you're in and ask yourself, how are they progressing? Maybe think about the recent past. Think about the last couple of weeks. How has another person behaved? Are you happy with their behavior? And now that there's a full moon, you have a chance to change things. You have a chance to change things. It doesn't mean to say you will change things. You might decide to just carry on as normal, but with that awareness. An awareness that things aren't the same, that you're going to see someone in a different way. But you don't want to feel hemmed in. You don't want to feel frustrated. If you can see a person or perhaps a situation for what it really is, then I think it would be best if you plan some kind of action. What are you going to do? I don't think this weekend, by the way, is necessarily the right time for taking action. Perhaps it's more about realization, though, on a positive note, the moon is making a conjunction to Jupiter, just after the full moon. And, moon is, of course, your ruler. Jupiter is a fortunate planet. It's in Cancer. So with that moon-Jupiter conjunction, okay, that moon-Jupiter conjunction may be a point of realization, but it might also be a point of good fortune when you start to understand what you can do. You may really understand how you can be free. You may get a vision of your own freedom. Perhaps you can't realize that full vision right now over the weekend, but perhaps over the next week you can start to use the power of that Moon-Jupiter conjunction. But maybe over the weekend with that Moon-Jupiter conjunction, something might happen which makes you lucky. There is a stroke of luck. You see an opportunity and you decide that you're going to go for it. So I'm not saying that it's going to be a straightforward weekend. How can it be a straightforward weekend with a full moon? There's a lot to realize. There's a lot to understand. But there are plenty of silver linings there. And I think that you will start to have a clear understanding about what needs to be done, what you'd like to do, what you want to keep, and also what you want to let go of. Leo, full moon, and this full moon, I mean, it's got to affect you at some level because it involves the sun. I mean, the sun is, of course, your ruler, and so with this full moon, something is perhaps becoming clear. It may not be entirely easy. You would like things, Leo, to be pretty straightforward. I mean, you don't want surprises. You want to be, as far as is possible, in control, and you want to be able to predict, what is going to be, happening next. But that might be difficult. There might be just things going on that you hadn't planned for, you hadn't prepared for, and that's absolutely not what you wanted. And you might have a certain tendency to regard the unexpected as a challenge, as something to be resisted. But that's not necessarily the case. It may be that things happen, but at first you respond to them negatively. But if you give yourself a chance, you might see that what seems difficult could actually be an opportunity, could be a real positive. And what can happen? Things can happen out of nowhere. I mean, not dramatic things. It is, in some respects, an undramatic weekend. Particularly on Saturday. I mean, there's nothing that you necessarily should be doing. I mean, I do think it actually could be a dramatic weekend for the world in some respects. I mean, I'll be talking about this full moon, later in the video in detail. But as far as you are concerned, there's a lot of work to do, perhaps in quite a private way. A lot of things to realize, a lot of things to think about, and realizations. Some of them are not entirely comprehensible, but there is a realization, and that something's changed. But that might be troubling because it might just disrupt your flow, and because you want things to be, I think you do want things to be well organized, and it just may be, Leo, that there's something else you have to incorporate that you don't want to incorporate. There's too much effort to incorporate. It's something you don't want to bother with, but it's worth your while somehow bringing it in and making it part of who you are, and also part of what you are planning. Additionally, Leo, there just could be a feeling of tension, just a feeling that something has gone on for too long, and that something needs to change dramatically and quickly. Now, this might just be a passing phase, but it's happening at the time of a full moon, and so this full moons can be about endings, and they can also be about realizations, and you're not entirely relaxed, but there's not necessarily much you can do about it in the short term. But it's important that whatever you feel, you don't take it out on other people, for example. There is a conjunction between the Sun and Venus. And with this Sun-Venus conjunction, you think about it, Venus is getting close to the Sun. The Sun is your ruler. So there may be times over the course of a weekend when you don't give another person enough respect, enough space, enough consideration. I mean, Sun and Venus is combust, and you may be combusting another person. They can't fully express themselves. So I think, Leo, a lot of self-awareness is needed, particularly in terms of relationships. Really think about how you are interacting with other people, what you're giving off, whether or not you're giving other people, the freedom they need. And, this Sun-Venus conjunction is not just necessarily about you undermining other people. It could also be about you undermining your own ambitions. That's not something you want to do, but you might be just too focused on what needs to be done, what you'd like to be doing, what you should be doing, and you just don't see the big picture. And you might sort of trip yourself up. And do think about how you are planning things. If you are planning things, or if you're working over the weekend, you can certainly put a lot of effort into your work and into getting things right. But sometimes the road to hell can be paved with good intentions. You try really hard, but your efforts could be your undoing. So don't just mindlessly do something because it feels appropriate, because it's just something to do. You have to think about what the broader picture is. And if you're too rigorous, if you're too single-minded, it's just possible that you could trip yourself up. Now, on Sunday, the moon does move into Leo. So I make it that on Sunday, I'd make it at sort of 1:43 p.m. London time. So that would be Sunday morning if you're in the Americas, late on Sunday if you're in Australia or New Zealand. So moon moving into Leo, that means that the sort of immediate part of the full moon is over. We no longer have a situation where the moon is in Cancer and the sun is in Capricorn, opposite each other. Now the moon has slipped into Leo, and that might just make things easier. For a start, the moon is moving into a positive sign. We've had, for the first part of the weekend, we've got nothing in positive signs. I mean, except Pluto in Aquarius and Chiron in Aries, but they don't really count. But with the moon moving into Leo, you start to see some light. You start to see possibilities, and it's not that you have to necessarily do anything, but you realize that you can take action. So, beginning of a weekend, you might have felt there's nothing you could do, but once the moon does move into Leo, you see the possibility of doing something. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you are going to actually be able to do it. I mean, the moon makes an opposition to Pluto, and, well, that's about it. So, I mean, I'm not saying that moon going into Leo is going to solve everything, but I think overall you're just going to be more positive and more constructive, and I think it might be a change of attitude, and I think that your attitude change will be for the better. So maybe by the end of a weekend, you're going to have some idea about what can be done, but still that there is a lot to think about, Leo, and don't feel that you're taking the weight of the world on your shoulders. That's not necessary, and at the same time, don't be too intense, particularly when dealing with other people. Virgo. It's quite a hectic weekend in an understated way. I mean, it's a weekend where there are no planets in positive signs. The positive signs are, of course, fire and air, and okay, we do get the moon moving into Leo in the end, and yes, you could say, well, Pluto's in Aquarius, but Pluto's a generational planet. That doesn't really count. But there are things going on. For example, we've got a full moon, and this full moon. What's this full moon going to do? It may remind you perhaps of what needs to be added. This full moon could, for example, be about missing ingredients. So, Virgo, you might have some wonderful ideas. There may be things you'd like to do. Maybe the things you are doing, and you're being successful up to a point, but there's still something missing. And so, what is missing? And this full moon, Virgo, might give you insights into actually what needs to be done. And maybe you have been sort of too mechanical in certain respects. You've looked at things in just one way. You said, well, you're going to do this and you're going to do that, and you go through the motions. But have you really got into the heart of the thing? And the answer may be no. And so with this full moon, with the moon moving into Cancer, because Jupiter's in Cancer as well, that gives you a different dimension. It allows you to see something in a new way, and just be aware of what you've been missing, perhaps on an emotional level. And it just could be that there just wasn't in the past enough emotional engagement. Just going through the motions wasn't enough. But now you perhaps are aware of what needs to be done to feel that you're doing something that is really satisfying. And perhaps satisfaction needs alignment, perhaps alignment to certain other people, and also alignment to your wider goals, your plans for the future. Where does it fit in? It's nothing is isolated. Everything needs to be connected, and perhaps this full moon does just allow you to start to think about what is missing and what you can do to make something whole. And I do think that there is an emotional dimension to it, and perhaps you need to spend more time listening to other people, seeing what they have got to say, and looking at their responses, and realizing that maybe you're not alone and that you don't have to do things alone. And maybe that's part of what I mean by some kind of missing ingredient. It needs to be perhaps socially based, but it also needs to be organic, and there needs to be some kind of spontaneity here. And these are things that Virgos, often have to think about. Virgos can be very good at doing things properly, but sometimes doing things properly, isn't quite good enough, and therefore a degree of change is necessary. And then there's the question of how do you create change? I mean, change can take place on an emotional level. You just feel differently, but it can also start with the intellect. And one aspect that we do have over the weekend is a quintile between Mercury and Uranus. Of course, Mercury is your ruler, and if it's making a quintile to Uranus, well, that can make you feel that you need inspiration, that you need to do things differently. Now, if we're talking about biquintile, we're talking about an aspect that is somewhat contrived. And I use the word contrived with quintiles, quite often. What do I mean by contrived? It's not spontaneous. It's something you have to create to begin with on your own, step by step. So you might identify the need for a change, the need to brighten things up, to provide the spark, and it's hard work, but it's the kind of work that a Virgo can deal with. And so I earlier in this piece on Virgo, I was talking about the fact that you need to be perhaps more spontaneous, you need to be a little more emotional, and sometimes that just happens naturally, but other times you just make a decision. This is the way it's going to be, and you to begin with plan it. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this, and that's how it's going to be. Then you execute the plan, and maybe in terms of the execution of the plan, that's a moment where you decide to let go, where you decide to become part of something else. Of course, never abandoning your fundamental independence, but just letting go and being a unique individual, but at the same time respecting other people as well. And so you can be unique, you can be part of something, and it's not an entirely spontaneous process, but it's a process you are involved with, and you do know that change is required. So perhaps this weekend, overall is about you making a decision to just become part of the flow, without, of course, abandoning your fundamental identity. And if you can do that, then you can start to tune into your fundamental creativity, but to start to do it not in a way that is just rather sort of perfunctory, just going through the motions, but you can do it in a way that is real and just feels that it's not just fundamental to you, it's just fundamental to something beyond yourself, and certainly it becomes part of your overall path forward, and it maybe says something about how you're going to deal with 2026. So maybe this weekend in terms of 2026 is a turning point where you make a decision that you're going to really be yourself and go beyond mere planning. Libra. Venus is getting really close to the sun. I think I said that I said that probably yesterday as well. It's really close now. I mean, it's by well, less than a degree. So if we're talking about Venus getting close to the Sun, then Libra, you perhaps have to be aware of it. You don't want to sort of end up like Icarus, sort of flying too high and the wax, keeping your wings together. It'll, you come down to earth. I mean, that's one way of getting too close to the Sun, but probably it's more like just something getting in your way, blocking the light. I mean, you'd like to see the light, you'd like to see out, but maybe this is difficult. Maybe you don't want to see. You'd rather maybe look the other way. So Libra, that certainly is a possibility. And it's all tied up with the fact that we've got these 4 planets in Capricorn. That weighs heavily, having 4 planets in Capricorn. I mean, Capricorn, is the sign at the bottom of your chart, and it can weigh you down. You're thinking perhaps too much about your own security, your own space. You want to be in control, but you can be too much in control, and there just may be things that you're missing, or things that you're losing contact with, and you might then not quite know what to do. And if you're too focused on your immediate surroundings, it may then be the case that you can't take coherent action. If you do take action, it may be misdirected, or you might be working on the basis of false information. And it's not actually a weekend for doing anything positive. It's not. It really isn't. But you can still just be overly negative. Perhaps because you are in one place, because you are thinking about one thing. It's all a bit one-dimensional, and what you need is a counterpoint. Now, that counterpoint is certainly provided because over the weekend we have a full moon. We have a full moon, which is it's in Cancer. This full moon is opposite Venus, and this full moon is a challenge. And it might be this full moon is about something that you kind of know is important, but you just haven't taken it seriously. You've refused to take it seriously. And when we're talking about full moons, it's tempting to talk about events and spectacular things going on, maybe good, maybe bad. But very often full moons take place, work on a psychological level. And you kind of know that there is just something you've been ignoring, and it's represented by the moon in Cancer. It's moving towards a conjunction of Jupiter, so you've got moon Jupiter conjunction in Cancer, but you're looking the other way. And it might be, Libra, that you're just looking away from your own luck. So if something is knocking on the door, something is asking for your attention, and you're just looking the other way, it may be something entirely positive. It might be the way forward for you. It could even be the past knocking on the door. And when I say the past knocking on the door, it could be about a possibility from the past, something you perhaps gave up on. Maybe you gave up on it last year, last week. Maybe you gave up on it, I don't know, 50 years ago. Whatever it is, something you've given up on, it's trying to come back. It is knocking on the door. And so you are being challenged, but you don't want to see it. Part of you doesn't want to see it because, Venus is combust. Venus is close to the Sun. And so, Libra, it's very important that you are completely aware of what is happening, and you are prepared to be challenged. That is the nature of this full moon. This full moon is likely to be about the balance between, home and family on one side, and maybe work, ambitions, the outside world on the other side. And in terms of where the constructive path is, the constructive path is about you perhaps being centered, but moving out, being ready to move out. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to do anything dramatic. You don't. It's not that kind of weekend. But you need to just be aware of what the challenges are. And you need to be able to see them in a constructive way. Just because something is disturbing your peace of mind, Libra, doesn't mean to say it's a bad thing. And that disturbance can come from, it could be a literal knock on a door, it could be a phone call, it could be your own imagination, your own mind saying, well, this isn't quite good enough. But when you have that realization, it's not about doing anything particular. If you were to lash out or take some spontaneous action, probably wouldn't work. In fact, it could backfire. It's more about realization, and that's what full moons are about. Full moons are about just seeing the truth, seeing things the way they are. Once you see things, you can't unsee them, and you then have the ability to take action in the end. I don't think you have to take action this weekend. I don't even think that would necessarily be a good idea, but you see the possibilities. And because there is a Moon-Jupiter conjunction, that is a very fortunate conjunction. So there is something out there, Libra, that wants you to make the most of what you have. And if you're not getting it together, this something is going to want to get your attention. And so I think that this weekend may not be necessarily easy, but I think it could be a fortuitous turning point, provided you're sufficiently open-minded and flexible. Scorpio. Mars is it's quite busy at the moment. I mean, we shouldn't forget that the Sun is starting to make a conjunction to Mars. I mean, that the Sun-Mars conjunction is just a couple of degrees apart, and this Sun-Mars conjunction, you could say that it is activating you. There are things you want to do. You also may feel that you have to defend yourself. I mean, Sun and Mars, two very fiery, dynamic planets, and you put them together, and you find that they become very, very action orientated. They want to be noticed, and if they're not noticed, they can cause trouble. I mean, Scorpio, you can cause trouble, and part of it is the fact that you are strongly placed. So if you've got Mars is Mars in Capricorn, it's exalted. You might say it's strengthened by the Sun superficially, but there's just some possibility that you just take things too far. It might be in terms of what you say. There might be just rather a lot of action here. And why would this be the case? Well, I think part of it, Scorpio, is like I was saying yesterday on Friday, I think that you feel that something is holding you back, and therefore something needs to change. That if a gradual approach doesn't work, then you've got to use a sledgehammer, and that might seem the only way out. Now, I'm not saying that a metaphorical, symbolic sledgehammer is necessarily a bad instrument to use. Again, symbolically, that is the difference between gradual progress and the sledgehammer approach, and part of you is sort of tempted towards a sledgehammer approach, because if things don't change, this could just go on forever. And so let's move things forward dramatically. And so that might well be your inclination, and you may indeed have fantasies in this direction, because the weekend starts with a quintile between Mars and Saturn. Of course, Mars is your ruler. Saturn is quite a tough planet. quintile, 72 degrees, a fifth of a circle. It's what you're trying to get together. It's what you're trying to plan. And your view from a planning perspective is this is a situation, whatever the situation is, that needs to be taken seriously, and we perhaps need to systematically even destroy something or perhaps be quite tough on yourself. You could be quite tough on yourself with this Mars quintile Saturn. You might be deliberately tough on yourself, but you don't want to go too far. I mean, a bit of self-denial can be sort of useful and life-affirming. It gives us a reminder that we have control. That if we're not in control of if we're not in control of things happening externally, well, at least we are in control of ourselves, and that might be what Mars quintile Saturn is all about. And so perhaps you might take things too far. I mean, you don't want to deny your thing. You don't want to deny yourself things, but maybe at the beginning of a weekend that might be something that you are tempted to do. And then, of course, we have a full moon, and this full moon, Scorpio, is encouraging you perhaps to look further afield. Sometimes Scorpios can be just completely focused on one thing. This is what matters. Nothing else matters. But then the full moon is saying, oh, hold on, there is something else to consider. The moon in Cancer, close to Jupiter in Cancer. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? Now, you might say that you're not interested, that you might say that you've got it all sorted out, you don't need any help, you don't need any alternative views. But I think this full moon is asking you to look at things in a different way, and perhaps even to look at the spirituality of things. It's very easy to just look at events as they crop up. One event leads to another event, and you don't see the connection between events. You don't perhaps see the spirituality of events. You perhaps don't want to go beyond coincidence, but perhaps there is a guiding force here, and this full moon might be reminding you of it. And of course, Scorpio is a very spiritual sign. Scorpios understand the mysteries of life and death and transformation and progression, and so this full moon can just encourage you to make that change. It's perhaps not a change you want to make, but I think it is very much a change that you can make. Sagittarius. Moon and Jupiter are making a conjunction at some stage this weekend, and Moon-Jupiter conjunction, it tends to be a fortunate aspect, and it happens right after a full moon. And so this conjunction, we've got how many Moon-Jupiter conjunctions have you got left in the sign of Cancer? Off the top of my head, maybe 6. So you've got 6 more of these Moon-Jupiter conjunctions in Cancer. Then Jupiter moves into Leo, and that happens sometime in the summer. Is it July? I think it's July. So you do make the most of these Moon-Jupiter conjunctions, and these Moon-Jupiter conjunctions are pointing the way forward. They're giving you an idea about what can be done, and they're also highlighting areas perhaps where you have perhaps become a bit stuck, and you've maybe been stuck because you've just been looking at things in quite a sort of one-dimensional way. And this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, indeed this whole full moon, is encouraging you to see things differently, to be just aware that things maybe are deeper and more complicated than you'd like them to be. But just because something is deep and complicated doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, it means it's good. Because Sagittarius, right now, you're quite capable of dealing with things which are apparently difficult, complicated. Yeah, you're able to immerse yourself in the detail, in the emotional detail, in perhaps the transformation that inevitably comes about when you're dealing with complicated things which on the surface seem completely crazy, but when you actually get up to them, real close, then you can actually understand the mechanics of what is going on. And this applies to many different things. It might apply to relationships, to other people, how other people work. It's easy to regard other people as being fairly robotic. That's what we do. I mean, we can be in denial about it, but that's what humans do. We assume that people are going to behave in a particular way. It can be quite shocking when we realize that everyone is independent, that they have their own plans and they have their own consciousness. And now, Sagittarius, you're starting to become aware of this. And that may be part of what the full moon is about in terms of relationships, seeing the complexity of human nature, not just of your own nature, but of another person's nature. Now, there could be with this full moon a more sort of mundane explanation relating, for example, to money. So perhaps when it comes to money, being a Sagittarius, you'd like things to be straightforward. It's just how much money you've got in the bank. Simple as that. Money is money. Why make it more complicated than it needs be? But full moon may be indicating that money is not necessarily an easy subject. That doesn't mean it's a problematic subject, but there could be aspects of your finances that you've perhaps glossed over. You've treated it as being simple. Maybe there are things you kind of know about, or been aware that, this is probably more complicated than it seems on the surface, but you're not going to really worry about it. But maybe with this full moon, this is a time to start to think about the complications, that maybe things have tax implications, or maybe there are prior agreements that have to be taken into consideration. So your financial actions and your thoughts about how you're dealing with your money, with this full moon, you shouldn't just take things at face value. You must be ready to look at things in a way that is quite intense, but you can handle it. And by having an appreciation of complexity, of organizational and financial complexity, then you're giving yourself the understanding you don't just need, but it's an understanding that you're quite able to deal with. You can deal with things that are very, very complicated, and this is part of what Jupiter in Cancer is all about. Jupiter's your ruler. It's in Cancer, and while it's in Cancer, between now and I think July, off the top of my head, July. I think it's July. While it's in Cancer, that is very much a challenge for you, and I think that this full moon, very much, emphasizes this challenge. And with the moon making a conjunction to Jupiter, good luck is on your side if you're prepared to deal with things head on. I think that you will, in the end, be rewarded. Capricorn. It's full moon time. Yeah, there is a full moon this weekend, and you've got your 4 planets in Capricorn, and we have the moon making opposition to Mars, opposition to the Sun, opposition to Venus. I mean, this full moon is at 13 degrees 2 minutes Capricorn. Sorry, 13 degrees 2 minutes Cancer. So this full moon does matter, and this full moon is across the 1st, 7th house of your chart. So if we regard Capricorn as the 1st house, then Cancer is the 7th house, So if we're talking about first and the seventh house, inevitably we're talking about relationships, so that there could certainly be a relationship angle here. So what you've got here is you've got 4 planets in Capricorn. So with 4 planets in Capricorn, it may well be that you have a very strong sense of yourself and what you can do and your own power. And no doubt about it, you have a lot of power. It's like, you're the one holding the cards. I mean, if you regard each planet as a card, well, you're holding 4 cards. You're holding Mars, Sun, Venus, and Mercury. That's great. Good. That puts you in a strong position. But it's not all about you. And, with the Moon and Jupiter in Cancer, particularly the Moon in Cancer at the moment, and the fact that we've got this Cancer full moon, it's like Capricorn, there's just something else that needs to be considered. You may have got 90% of the answers, but there's still 10% of the answers you haven't got. And do consider what another person has to say. Don't just ignore them. Don't assume that they don't know what they're talking about. Even if you're dealing with someone who you have relative contempt for, or you're dismissive of their knowledge or their intellectual abilities, still make the effort to listen. People can accidentally come up with the answers. They just say it. They can't help it. And so don't take people for granted. Don't underestimate anyone. And also don't underestimate the benefits that another person can provide. There is a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter in Cancer in your opposite sign. So it's very important that you give everyone a chance, because you just never quite know what other people have to contribute. And I think right now they've got quite a lot to contribute. And with this full moon, you might have a realization about a particular relationship, maybe a set of relationships. You may start to see people, in a new light. Additionally, you might be challenged. You're presented with a different view. And when you're presented with a different view, there is a real possibility that your view is not necessarily the right view, that someone else accidentally, perhaps, has somehow arrived at the truth. And of course, truth is a very subjective thing, but if you see something that is startling or surprising in the outside world, if it's connected with another person, then ask yourself what is going on, and be ready to admit your own mistakes, or admit that you haven't got all the answers. And I think that is probably a good way of dealing with a full moon. But when we're talking about full moons, it just might well in general be about a change in one particular relationship. Relationships do change, and with this full moon, it might be about a set of realizations which has been coming together over the last few weeks, but now with this full moon, it may be starting to crystallize. Aquarius. I mentioned yesterday that we are starting to see a real elemental imbalance. There is only one planet in air signs, Pluto. There are no planets in fire signs. It's all sort of earth and water, and that might be taking its toll on you, Aquarius. You may be wondering where the action is. How can you respond to what is going on? And you may feel that you might feel disconnected. Now, on the positive side, very soon we're going to get loads of planets in Aquarius, because there are a lot of planets right now in Capricorn, but those planets in Capricorn must inevitably move into Aquarius and join Pluto in Aquarius. So that's going to happen relatively soon, in a few weeks' time. But for the moment, you just might feel that there's nothing very much you can do. You could try, but it's all going to be, rather difficult, and perhaps it's also going to be, unrewarding. And it's quite possible that the full moon is going to just emphasize this. This full moon, what, 13 degrees 2 minutes Cancer, it could be, well, it might just feel like more of the same. The new year is over. It's first weekend of the new year. Well, so what? What do you do? Well, what do you do? Well, you just carry on as normal. You realize that there are things that need to be done. It might not be very interesting, but it's still worth the effort. And if you're prepared to follow a plan, then I think you'll make good progress. It will not be spectacular progress, but you have to ask yourself, where is the luck? There is a conjunction between the moon and Jupiter in Cancer, and this moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer means that if you do things by the book, if you don't get distracted, then things just work out in a way that is very clear. It's systematic. It's not exciting, but in the end, you get the results, and that's the way to do it. And that is actually the way to deal with anything going on at an unconscious or emotional level. If you feel that you want to go off on a tangent, perhaps an emotional tangent, or you're imagining something, drifting off on fantasies that maybe seem to have no chance of realization, but you're drifting off and you're not entirely satisfied, you can bring this all down to earth by just doing something constructive. That's what you have to do, something which is very defined. I think this weekend actually you need defined tasks. Doing a task which has a beginning, a middle, and an ending, where you can know for sure that when it's done, it's done. For example, I don't know, putting together an IKEA chair. I mean, that is that is an example of a task with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And there might be something more profound you can do, some other task, maybe something you don't necessarily want to do, but you just go and do it over the weekend. And in the end, you feel a certain sense of satisfaction. And so that's perhaps the way to approach it, and not feel that you absolutely need to get feedback. I don't think you do need to get feedback. Now, the moon does move into Leo over the weekend. So when does it move into Leo? It moves into Leo on Sunday at 1:43 p.m. London time. So that means it moves into Leo sort of Sunday morning, or if you're in Australia or New Zealand, or maybe not until late on Sunday. If you're in New Zealand, probably early hours of Monday, I think. I should be a bit more clear about the New Zealand time zone, because I know some people watch this from New Zealand. But anyway, moon moving into Leo does create something of a change. I mean, for a start, the moon is moving into a fire sign, and that's good, because I just said he got no fire signs. Now we got a fire sign. It gives you some buzz, gives you a bit of spark on Sunday. So on Sunday, or perhaps early on Monday. So there's more stuff going on. There's something to focus on. There's some perhaps excitement, but with Moon in Leo, it may well come from another person, because of course Leo is your opposite sign, and the Moon does make an opposition to Pluto. So if you are going to benefit in the end from another person, it could be a benefit that comes from a certain amount of tension, because you've got Moon opposition Pluto. And maybe you get some insight into how things have been working recently. You've got Pluto in Aquarius. With Pluto in Aquarius, you are perhaps quite focused on yourself and your individuality, and what makes you special, what kind of changes you want to bring into your life. And then Moon opposition Pluto, Moon opposition Pluto, Moon in Leo is something else coming along. Maybe it's another person, and maybe you need that kind of dynamic excitement, that dynamic challenge, and maybe that will happen towards the end of a weekend. So if towards the end of a weekend you find yourself being challenged by someone, disagreeing with someone, getting even angry about someone, maybe you should be happy, because it does indicate that maybe something is going on. Pisces. Yeah, like Friday, we've got a lot of negativity, and I think that's the kind of negativity that does work in your favor. Of course, by negativity, I'm talking about the fact that there's this overwhelming emphasis in the negative signs. The negative signs are the earth signs and the water signs. And there's nothing wrong with being negative. I don't mean negative in a disparaging way. And so, you have the capacity to understand what's going on. It's just easy. There's nothing that you have to do. You can just respond in that sort of Pisces way, and you can certainly go with the flow. And it's all very easy. And for a Pisces, it's just water off a duck's back. It's just whatever the challenge, you get through. And so it's perhaps your kind of weekend, particularly on Saturday. But we do have a full moon, and full moons, or we always have to pay attention to full moons. And this full moon might be about you having to consider what it means to be independent. As a Pisces, you can spend a lot of time thinking about what's happening around you, what the pressures are. Sometimes you give in to these pressures. You don't always assert yourself as much as you should. It's all easy come, easy go. But with this full moon, we've got Moon in Cancer. We've also got Moon starting to make a conjunction to Jupiter. So we've got Moon Jupiter conjunction, opposite the Sun. So that's the definition of a full moon. Moon opposition the Sun, and perhaps you need to challenge certain assumptions. Perhaps challenge assumptions that other people are making, or perhaps assumptions that society is making. You're very aware of what is happening in society, and it's possible that sometimes you kind of find yourself fitting in to what is happening around you, and that might be easy, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do. And you do have to think about what makes you different, and what is your unique contribution. And this is the first full moon of 2026, and this full moon is about the challenge of Jupiter in Cancer. Jupiter's been in Cancer since last summer. It's going to be in Cancer, I think, until July of next year. Really make the most of Jupiter in Cancer. Remember, Jupiter's your ruler. Jupiter's exalted in Cancer. And so this full moon is asking you to really stand up, not just this weekend, but for the rest of the year, or certainly until Jupiter moves into Leo, and to think about what makes you different. It's asking you to define yourself. Sometimes, being a Pisces, you don't define yourself. You just you fit in. You go with the flow. You go with the tide. That's all well and good. But there comes a moment where you have to decide where the tide stops and where you start, where the waters stop, where you start. Indeed, where your ego lies. I mean, spiritually, people talk about, the ego as often as being something bad. But just remember, if you don't have an ego, you're nothing. It's losing one's ego. Well, that's a path to sort of dissolution and potentially madness, and that's not what we want, is it? I'm sorry, I'm being a bit over dramatic there, but you've got to think about what is you, and what makes you special. And that's all about this Jupiter moving through Cancer. And I think that this full moon is a reminder of this. You can in fact see everything that is holding you back, everything that is trying to get you to conform, and you can now see what you have to do. But just because you see what you have to do doesn't mean you're actually going to do it. But I think Pisces, with Saturn moving through your sign, and I think it's great that Saturn is still moving through your sign. It's going to be moving through your sign for the next 6 weeks until it does move into Aries in mid-February. But while Saturn is moving through Pisces, you can really have a strong sense of your boundaries, what's important to you, what you need to get together, and that all links in with this full moon. So overall, I think that this full moon should be something very positive, and should allow you to really define who you are and what makes you special. So those are my forecasts for the 12 signs, and it's now time to shift gear and move into the I Ching. So as far as the I Ching is concerned, I asked the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 13, fellowship with others. So the Wilhelm translation of the I Ching calls this fellowship with men, but I think fellowship with others is probably better. I think the trouble with the Wilhelm translation, fellowship with men, I think it makes it's sort of gendered fellowship with men, and I don't think that's what the I Ching means. I think it's just fellowship with other people in general. I mean, I'm afraid I don't speak Chinese. Certainly don't understand classical Chinese. I don't understand Chinese in any way, shape, or form. That is the problem of me and the I Ching. I'm always sort of reliant on someone else's texts. I mean, maybe that's just the nature of the I Ching, because it's an oracle of the book. Unlike something like astrology or tarot, where there's more scope for your own individual interpretations. But fellowship with others, you are thinking perhaps this weekend about who is around you, what is around you, where you fit in socially. It may be difficult to avoid other people. I mean, in terms of whatever you're trying to do, whatever your projects you're trying to get together, and so that perhaps should be your focus. But the issue we have here is that the third line moves. The third line from the bottom, it moves. Now, in the I Ching, the third line is often difficult, and certainly it's difficult with this hexagram. And so with this third line moving, well, it might indicate, in spite of all this stuff about fellowship with others and other people matter, or other people really mattering. Is that the right word, mattering? It doesn't sound a bit strange. People do matter. There is some disharmony here. There is a lack of trust. Who can you trust? Maybe you can't trust anyone, or maybe you're just feeling mistrustful for no good reason. But whatever it is, a lack of trust prevents you from really getting too close to people and being able to benefit from them. So that is one way of looking at it. I mean, there is an alternative view. I mean, this third line is really saying, don't do anything, don't take any action. If you do take action, it could be unfortunate. And one image we have with this third line is you climb a hill and you don't do anything for 3 years, I think. So don't climb a hill. Hills should not be climbed. So if you're hiking over the weekend, maybe you shouldn't. Hills should be avoided. So the reason is you climb a hill, you put in all this effort in climbing a hill, and then after that, you don't make any progress. You've done yourself in. And so trying too hard to start something off, it might be what we want to do. Maybe it's about taking social initiatives. We want to take a social initiative. That seems to be the right thing to do. It's New Year, first weekend of a new year. Let's get going. But the I Ching is saying, no, don't necessarily do that. Nothing should be done. And perhaps this is in accord with the full moon. I mean, arguably it is a difficult full moon. I mean, I'm about to talk about the full moon in detail. The full moon, it's tied up with Uranus by semi-square, sesquiquadrate, and Mars. There's a lot of stuff going on with this full moon. And this full moon is it's just not a good time for a start. You should be starting things on a new moon, not the full moon. So if you do take the initiative, it could go wrong. And so maybe there's an argument for saying, well, nothing should be done. Don't push it. Now, third line moving does mean we move to a second hexagram. And the second hexagram we move to is hexagram number 25, which is innocence. Not such a bad hexagram. And it's about not having any expectations. We're open to anything. So perhaps with the previous hexagram, fellowship with others, we're trying too hard. We're trying to climb a hill. We're trying to get something going. But we shouldn't. We shouldn't do anything. We should just stay where we are. And innocence says, if we wait patiently, who knows what might come up. But we shouldn't have any idea about what's going to come up. We shouldn't even think about it. We should think it's just going to be a boring weekend. And if we think with a boring week, it's going to be a boring weekend, well, in that moment where we give up on anything happening, maybe that's when something will happen. And there is an implication here, innocence, but if things do happen, they're likely to be, in the end, fortunate. But we don't want to destroy that luck by overthinking. So overall, I think that this weekend should be quite passive. We might feel we should be doing things, but it's not that kind of weekend. And perhaps this links to the fact we've got this earth-water emphasis at the time of a full moon. What are we going to contribute? What are we going to put forward? In the short term, we should try and put forward nothing and just see what happens. And perhaps we need to respond. We wait for the action. Then we can respond as we see fit. And so finally, I need to talk about the full moon. And there is a full moon this weekend for sure. And so let's have a look at this full moon. That's why I've got a full moon on the thumbnail of this video. So as far as the full moon is concerned, let's find it. So here it is. So this full moon takes place at 5:03 a.m. In Washington, D.C. I've kind of broken from my normal pattern here. I've normally set my full moons for Westminster, but this full moon is set for the East Coast of the US. There's no particular reason why it should be set for there. And so we've got Moon in Cancer and opposition the Sun in Capricorn. And so what is the nature of this full moon? Well, we can talk about full moons in general. We can say, well, full moons tend to be less fortunate than new moons. With the full moon, that is the moment when the moon moves from waxing to waning. It's now getting smaller. Of course, where I am, there's a lot of clouds here at the moment, but if you can see the moon, it's as big as it gets. And it's kind of weird to get a full moon right at the beginning of a new year, because we think of a new year as being the new beginning. It's a very kind of new moon kind of event. But this year, 2026, maybe it has a bit of a full moon feel. We see the results of everything that has happened, and we see it for what it is, and we have to deal with the consequences. And I think that there may be an argument for that if you think about what's been happening over 2025. A lot of things are up in the air. A lot of things have not been resolved. And with the full moon, Everything is perhaps coming clearer. Things are coming home to roost, are they not? With this full moon, and full moons are about realization. That's kind of something I've been trying to say. I was trying to say in my forecast of the 12 signs. We see things for what they really are. As far as the nature of this particular full moon, so if you want to try and understand a full moon, well, you need to look at what is aspecting it. And, straight away we can see that this full moon is conjunct Venus, conjunct Mars. It's also aspected by Uranus. Now, that's not quite so obvious, but Uranus is at 2753 Taurus. So Uranus is making a 45-degree aspect to the moon, and it's making an 135-degree aspect to the sun. That is going to colour this full moon. And I think that Uranus is just as important as the Mars. I mean, Mars is now moving away from the sesquiquadrate with Uranus, because the Mars sesquiquadrate Uranus was one of the features of the new year. And so full moon on Venus and on Mars. So you might say, okay, this full moon is on the Venus-Mars conjunction, so there may be a Venus-Mars feel to this full moon. Venus-Mars it's about attraction, it's about relationships, I suppose Venus-Mars can be about sexuality, how people get on. Do people find each other attractive, or do they find each other repulsive? Can work both ways with Venus-Mars. And so that could be a theme. I mean, one way of looking at this full moon, perhaps even on a personal level, is suddenly realizing you find someone repulsive. You just cannot stand them. It's a Venus-Mars thing. It just may be about pure attraction. I mean, it could work the other way, finding someone attractive, but attraction and repulsion seem to be a key theme of this full moon. And that can be very personal. I mean, it may be collective as well. Or groups finding each other attractive or repulsive. Changes, it may be sort of diplomatically. I mean, that is a collective way of looking at it. Then you've got this full moon tied up with Mars. I mean, Mars is an aggressive planet. It's about anger. It's about falling out. And that kind of links to what I said about attraction and repulsion, but it also in a collective way. That's what it can be. What it can be like. But there's Venus is involved. You could say, well, this full moon is connected with Venus. So, yeah, which one do you want to go for? Yeah, do you want to go for the attraction and the aesthetics of Venus? Full moon may be an awareness of beauty. It may be an awareness of ugliness. And you can see perhaps ugliness and beauty are kind of linked up with each other. And then this full moon is linked up with Uranus as well. I mean, that Uranus is earthquakes, explosions, the unexpected. And so looking at this full moon, just in terms of a chart, I think this full moon is quite heavy. I really do. I think it's potentially a very difficult full moon because it's linked up with Mars and Uranus, maybe because it's linked up with the Venus as well, and so it on an individual level, yeah, a lot to do with relationships potentially, and how one gets on with people, and how one realizes maybe one doesn't like someone anymore. Could work the other way, maybe about attraction. So it could work in different ways. And then looking at this full moon from a perspective of the 90-degree dial, let's look at it in that way. So, for example, to see what kind of midpoints this full moon is on. So here it is. So there's the full moon. So full moon, this is a 90-degree dial. Because it's a 90-degree dial, the sun and the moon are shown as being a conjunction. There's the sun and the moon. So this full moon on a 90-degree dial, yeah, it's counted as being 13 degrees too. So as far as the midpoints are concerned, you can see that it's on the Venus-Mars midpoint, and it's on the Venus-Mars midpoint, and that's what I was saying about attraction and repulsion. It's also opposition Uranus, and that's probably important. I mean, I'm sure that's important. Why is it opposition Uranus? Because the full moon is semi-square and sesquiquadrate the full moon. So semi-squares and sesquiquadrates are shown as an opposition. So I think that the Uranus nature of this full moon is really important. And so we can perhaps look at the midpoints that Uranus is on. So if we move the dial round. There's Uranus. Uranus is on the Venus-Mars midpoint. And, of course, by definition, Uranus is aspecting the Sun-Moon midpoint. So Uranus on the Sun-Moon midpoint, it's a very Uranus full moon. Uranus is semi-square, sesquiquadrate, semi-square, sesquiquadrate, the Sun-Moon midpoint. So, yeah, Uranus is strong. And Uranus on the Venus-Mars midpoint, one way in which you can look at Uranus on the Venus-Mars midpoint is if someone, for example, who has Uranus on their Venus-Mars midpoint in their natal chart, that can represent someone who falls in and out of love very quickly. And that might be a dimension of Uranus and Venus, moments of passion, but also passion can dissipate very, very quickly. That can be how Uranus aspecting the Venus-Mars midpoint works. So that's the general picture of this full moon. And then there's the question of astrocartography. And there are certain locations that I am very interested in with this full moon. So looking at the astro map, and this full moon, so the places, a place that a place that I am interested in is, well, there's Europe. I mean, Europe is definitely hit. So these, if you look at these yellow lines, that yellow line here is, all the places where Saturn is conjunct the ascendant at the time of the full moon. And this line, you can see it goes through Berlin. And then you've got, you see these red lines, I mean, going right through Ukraine and going through Western Turkey. So these red lines, those red lines represent the Sun, Venus, Mars conjunction, which is opposition the moon. So Ukraine and Western Turkey, very much hit. Cairo as well. I don't know what's happening in Egypt and Turkey. I haven't really been following Egypt and Turkey. Misses Gaza. So Gaza is here, but it seems to be Egypt and Sudan. Sudan, there's always stuff going on in Sudan. There's very horrible stuff going on in Sudan. People have sort of forgotten the unfolding disaster in Sudan, maybe because they've been focusing on Gaza, but I mean, Sudan is whatever's going on in Sudan, it's really bad, and to my shame I don't really know much about it, but it's a huge amount of people have been killed in Sudan, and it's right next to Gaza. Gaza is not so far away, but people have decided to focus on Gaza and not Sudan. Now that seems to be a bit strange. I don't know. I don't want to upset anyone. That's just my observation. So let's look at some charts. Then we'll also be looking at the Washington D.C. chart, because Saturn is hitting the full moon chart, except for Washington D.C. So starting with what I noticed in Europe, if we set the chart for Berlin. So here is the full moon for Berlin, and Berlin has Saturn on the ascendant. It's not exactly on the ascendant, but I know that things are not great in Germany, at least in a political sense. That the economy continues to be under pressure, like a lot of places in Europe, and Germany is not alone in this. But it's not easy. You think about industrial production. You also think about you've got the Chancellor's continued obsession with Ukraine. Maybe that Saturn on the ascendant is saying something about it, and he's having disagreements with other European leaders about what to do about Ukraine, about money and how to get more money to Ukraine, and how you take out loans, to whether or not you use Russian money. So that's all sort of a background issue for Germany, and sort of other places. There is the United States itself, and I'm sort of going to sort of move from sort of one place to another. And looking at the US, there are reasons to be very concerned about the US. So if we go back to the full moon chart, I've set this for Washington DC, which is obviously the capital of the United States. So if we want to know about the full moon, sort of politically, Saturn is exactly conjunct the IC when we set the full moon for the US. Moon is on the 8th house cusp, and with Neptune is pretty close to the IC as well. And so this is the first full moon of the year. And I'm thinking that this may create some very real problems for the United States. The question is what? Something perhaps quite foundational. I mean, this may just hint to the divisiveness going on in the US. Might it say something about American foreign policy? Well, it could. I mean, we need to think about Venezuela. We need to think about Ukraine. I will be talking about Venezuela and Ukraine in a moment. But there is something really eating away at the foundations of the country, with this Saturn Neptune on the IC. Now, I don't want to over dramatize, but we should not forget that this full moon is at 13 degrees 2 minutes Cancer. So looking at the United States' horoscope, 1776, the sun is at 13 degrees 19 Cancer. So this full moon is right on the United States' sun. Plus, as I've just shown you, we've got Saturn is on the IC at the time of the full moon set for Washington DC. So the United States' sun is kind of in the 8th house. There is an 8th house feel to it, and it just could be that with this full moon, America's getting itself involved in something. Maybe it shouldn't be touching. There's just something wrong here, and I do think we need to think about what this might mean. And the question is, where might it be? And of course, we think about Venezuela, and if we look at one of the horoscopes for Venezuela, here's a chart for one of the Venezuela independence charts. So this is set for July the 5th, 1811. Kind of interesting that the United States has its independence day just after July the 4th, and so on July the 5th, Venezuela has its sun at 12 degrees 47 Cancer. So this full moon is right on Venezuela's sun. So Venezuela has its Mars on its sun. It also has Uranus aspecting its sun. I mean, Venezuela has a sun trine Uranus in its natal chart, and now with this full moon hitting its sun, so it may be that this really highlights the fact that we should be looking at Venezuela. I mean, obviously, you don't need astrology to tell you that, but that the full moon is kind of reinforcing what we already know. And then there is Ukraine, and Ukraine. If we set the full moon for Kiev, we get this chart. This full moon is exactly on Ukraine's midheaven. So the midheaven, you could say that the midheaven is the government, perhaps, potentially. And so you've got, so you may say something about Zelensky and how much control he has. So we've got this full moon, and remember it's a full moon, conjunct Venus, conjunct Mars, right on the midheaven at that precise time. So, you know, with Ukraine, I mean, Zelensky just goes on and on and on. I can. It doesn't matter what I see in his chart. He just goes on. He seems to be completely, like the Teflon president. Nothing seems to get in. Nothing seems to stop him. Even though he's making some absolutely disastrous decisions for his country, he just goes on. But still, this full moon definitely hits Ukraine, right on Ukraine's midheaven. I mean, or rather, not on Ukraine's midheaven, but not the chart of Ukraine, but at that precise time of the full moon. That full moon is on the midheaven, MCIC set for Kiev, and this is confirmed also by Ukraine's horoscope. So if we turn to Ukraine's horoscope here, Ukraine's Venus is at 28 degrees 9. 28 degrees 9 Leo. So what this means is that this full moon is exactly semi-square sesquiquadrate Ukraine's Venus. And yeah, that Venus is somewhat difficult. I mean, it's Venus in the on the eighth house cusp, and it might sort of bring something out. I mean, a Venus, how do you see as Venus? I mean, the Venus is a general significator of women. It also could be about the economy. And so I would not have said that full moon hitting Ukraine's Venus by semi-square sesquiquadrate is particularly fortunate. Plus, Uranus is square that Venus. And, we have to look at what Venus is doing in terms of midpoints. So if we turn to if we look at Ukraine's horoscope on the 90-degree dial, there's Ukraine's Venus, and so we need to look very carefully at what midpoints Venus is on. So Ukraine's Venus is almost exactly making an exact square to the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So this full moon, if we take the independence chart for Ukraine, it's on Ukraine's Mars-Saturn midpoint. And I think, given the fact that the full moon is on the meridian, is on the MCIC axis, at that precise moment of the full moon, set for Kiev, we've got two things going on at the same time. So I'm thinking that there is going to be something going on in Ukraine which is more than usual. I mean, I know things are always going on in Ukraine, so it's like always, but it's probably something to do with the government, not necessarily about some military defeat, but I think that the government is going to perhaps start its final, its final plunge, maybe in terms of Zelensky and his government with this full moon. Maybe the fat lady is starting to sing. Maybe at the very least, the fat lady is now starting to clear her throat. I mean, maybe it's coming to that stage now with Ukraine, and I think this full moon is a real negative, certainly for the Zelensky regime. And so that's Ukraine. I did very quickly want to mention Turkey, by the way. Mars is on the midheaven in Turkey. So this full moon is on the MCIC axis because Ankara, the capital of Turkey, is on pretty much the same meridian as Kiev. So it's not quite as close as it is with Kiev, but maybe we should be looking at Turkey. Maybe there's something to do with the economy or something to do with the government or what Erdogan is doing. I don't know. I don't really know very much about what's going on in Turkey. And then a couple of other things to mention about this full moon. It is, in terms of the UK, there is the moment that Keir Starmer became Prime Minister was on July the 5th, 2024. So the Starmer regime has its sun at 13 degrees 55 Cancer. That's when he became Prime Minister, and the moon is on the Starmer regime's sun. That means that Mars is, it's all linked up with Mars and Venus. So I think that from perspective of Starmer regime, every day you get YouTube videos saying, how long is Starmer going to last? I think the experts say that Starmer's going to last well until the May local elections, or maybe there is a view that he'll be able to go on further than that. But I think that more stuff is happening with Starmer, the Labour government, more revelations. This full moon certainly doesn't really look very good for them. So very quickly, I'm not going to spend any time at all on it, but just 3 people who I notice are impacted by this full moon. One is Elon Musk. Elon Musk has this full moon right across his ascendant, because he's got 13 degrees 30 ascendant, plus it links up with his Mars. What is Elon Musk doing? May say something about his relationships, the people he has to deal with. Maybe it's Musk feels he has to do something else with his full moon. Maybe Musk is challenged by this full moon and he has to make an appearance or do something. But he does have Mars crossing his descendant with full moon linked up with Mars, so maybe Musk has to be careful how he goes, and certainly he should be careful in terms of how he deals with the people close to him. And another person is George Bush Jr. Remember, George Bush Jr., one of the reasons he became president of the United States, because he resonated to the United States, because he was born on July the 6th. His sun is at 13 degrees 47 Cancer. So we don't see much of George Bush, but with full moon, Mars opposition his sun, he's going to be 80 this year. So, I suppose George Bush has to be careful how he goes. And additionally, maybe he needs to steer clear of controversy, but that's what he always tries to do. I mean, he's definitely stayed away from politics since he left the White House, and unlike Obama, for example. And finally, there is Boris Johnson. I haven't got Boris Johnson's chart. Let's have a quick look at Boris Johnson's chart. Boris Johnson was a former British Prime Minister. I don't know quite what his plans are, but Boris Johnson has his midheaven at 12 degrees 52 Cancer. So this full moon is right across his midheaven. Is it going to be good or bad? I don't know. It might be difficult. He's got Mars on his IC. That's okay. He's already had it's past exact, but I don't know. That may say something about Boris's plans or maybe Boris's reputation. I don't know. We'll have to see. So that's it. That's all I've got to say about the full moon. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again very soon.